art and science, it was an absolute no-brainer that Francesc should be a part of this project because his whole work from the beginning has dealt with issues of historical memory, the legacies of violence from the past on the present, and you will see a lot of these issues in his presentation today. Francesc Torres is a multimedia artist born in Barcelona who has lived for extensive periods in Paris, New York, and Berlin, as well as his native Catalonia. And he's basically, you know, citizen of the world, really. He curates exhibitions, writes for several journals internationally and newspapers in Spain, and has been the president of the Catalan Association of Visual Artists. He is shown at many of the most prestigious museums worldwide and has twice represented his country in the Venice Biennale. He has been the recipient of, among others, and it would be way too long to mention all of the awards he has received, but just a few. The New York Council for the Arts Fellowship on 2 occasions, the Fulbright Academic Exchange Fellowship. He has received the Visual Arts National Prize given by the Autonomous Government of Catalonia. He was in 2006-07 chair in Spanish Culture and Civilization at the King Juan Carlos I of Spain Center at New York University. He currently has 2 major exhibits in 2, well, one maybe has closed, but it has recently had one and has now major exhibits in 2 major museums in Barcelona, and has received 2 major prizes in Catalunya for at least one of them, and who knows, the second may well receive something. We'll put in a good word. So it's a great pleasure, Francesc, to have you back with us.
Thank you.
And his talk today is Art and Trauma, the Fateful Connection.
All right, thank you for being here. What I had to decide what I was going to show, because, so I'm going to start with 2 works, maybe 3 if we have enough time, that are not so recent, but they exemplify very, very well what my work has been about, and I think if I'm interested about it, from, as Ophelia was saying, almost from the beginning, namely, history and social human behavior and what we do to each other, political ideology, and so on and so forth. This one, the first thing that I'm going to show is a good example of that, and it's also peculiar because it took a long time to become something. In the mid-late 80s, I was working on a project. Can you hear me? I was working on a project in cheetah, which is a town that just was unfortunate enough to be in Crossroads that had a strategic importance because of its location, and became a front during the Spanish Civil War. And it changed hands several times. It was first in fascist hands. It was taken over by the Republic, thanks to the work and the bravery of the American Abraham Lincoln Brigade, who was the American unit in the international brigades that were helping the legitimate government. Those were the people who actually took it, from the fascists, from Franco, and then later on in the war, that was retaken by the Francoist forces, and that was the end of it. Every time that there was a change of hands, of course, there was fighting in the village itself, and it got progressively destroyed. A lot of people died there, and it became a sort of weird memorial to the war. Franco decided that the village was not going to be rebuilt, what it was, and it was actually a village that was more than a village. It was kind of a small town with a lot of very good architecture, and But they said, no, we're not going to redo it. We're not going to fix it. We're going to leave it as a memorial to the war, and using Republican prisoners of war, a new cheetah was built just like half a kilometer away. Kind of, you know, very, very strange altogether. And one would expect that if this place was going to be a memorial to the war, that it was going to be kept accordingly. They didn't do anything. The first time that I went to see it, I knew of its existence because it's very famous for what happened. But I had not seen it until 1984. That's when I went on purpose, you know, to see it for the first time. It's really impressive. What I found was almost, you know, like a dump site. You know, it was all dirty. The peasants, every time that they had, you know, an animal that died, they would just, you know, throw it in amongst the ruins of the old town. It was really depressing. And how come that, you know, they respect so little their own history? You know, thinking of, you know, the other guys, the ones who won, and because of their winning, just, you know, made life in Spain intolerable for 4 years. So I started doing a project that was finally called the Cheetah South Bronx, in which I documented the entire town in Spain, the Cheetah, and then I did the same thing with the South Bronx in New York, which at the time, we're talking about, you know, the late, early 80s, mid 80s, it looked like Berlin in 1945. It was something absolutely, it would just, you know, make your hair stand on, at least mine. There were, you know, synagogues, churches of all denominations, you know, burned to the ground. I mean, it was just an incredible landscape of devastation. In New York, and peacetime, when, you know, several miles south, you know, in Manhattan, Wall Street was booming, and, you know, people were making a lot of money. So that made me wonder if that wasn't going to be, you know, using this material wasn't going to be a good way of exploring the dividing line, or lack of dividing line, between a time of organized violence or war, or at a time of non-organized violence or peace. And what was it that constituted civil war? In the case of Cheetah, it was very clear. But I thought that in the Bronx, since what happened there was the result of economic violence, you know, perpetrated by one group of Americans over another group, you know, that in a way also had certain characteristics that could be considered, at least conceptually, as a sort of civil war. So I documented both areas thoroughly, and I mixed them to create one single urban landscape. And the project was had three parts: a very large video installation, which was almost theatrical, because you could actually walk through it. And it's now in the permanent collection of the Reina Sofia Museum in Madrid. Then a single channel videotape that condensed everything in one single screen, so to speak. And finally, which was also an important part of the project, was a book. And I was doing, you know, one thing after the other because I didn't have money to do, you know, everything at the same time. When I reached the end of the process, which was the book, and I was still, you know, looking for resources, I thought of going to Zaragoza, which is about 250 kilometers from Barcelona, to talk to the people there, because Belchite is in that part of the country. To talk to them and see if they would be willing to collaborate in the project. And as I was, you know, talking to them, I think somebody said, you know, they just finished, just today, they finished the production of a film in Belchite. And so there must be a film about the Civil War, I figured. You know. And he said, no, a huge production, an American production with $40 million budget in the 1980s. That was a lot, though. And they just, you know, today there was the last day of the filming. Yeah. So I didn't have a camera. Of course, it took me completely by surprise. I borrowed the camera from someone. I grabbed the car, and I drove to cheetah, which is about 40, 50 kilometers from Zaragoza. And what I ran into was what was left after Terry Gilliam, one of the founders of Monty Python, had shot, which was, you probably remember the film, The Adventures of Baron Munchausen. And they needed an urban environment, 18th century, or it looked something like this, destroyed. And somebody said, look, in Spain, there's this place that is completely devastated, and you know, so why don't you use that? And that's exactly what he did. And it was a big production with Alec Guinness, Sting, you know, the star rooster was considerable. And so what they did, they went to talk to the mayor, because according to Spanish law, anything that happens in a particular location, the one who has the last word is the mayor, he or she. So they went to talk directly to the mayor, and of course the poor man, the thing that he saw when he saw them coming in was a big dollar sign, right? $40 million, you know, production, blah blah blah. So he gave them the permission to use the village, and so then what they did was they closed the perimeter. Nobody was allowed to go in. People from the new village, the new cheetah, which was next to it, they couldn't go and peek and see what was happening. They didn't spend a penny in the local economy. Everything that they needed, especially you know, food, was catered, you know, from outside. And when they finished, they left. And in the meantime, they did whatever they wanted in order to adapt what they found to the requirements of the script. So they built things on top of the ruin. And I managed to catch that before they took it down. And it was really freaky, because there were places in which you had to be knocking on the wall to find out where the real part of a cheetah ended and the faked one, you know, began. It was extremely well made. This image is one of the main squares. Of everything that you see here, the only thing that is original, that's real, is the church. The sculpture, that building, another building that was on this side, all this was, you know, cardboard, but very well made. So I thought, well, considering the history of the place, what went on at the time, that was 1980s, so 70 years ago, you know, the tragedy that represents, the amount of people that lost their lives and so on and so forth, to see all this transform into a farce, you know, into just a background, a backdrop for a comedy, you know, the film has its merits, you know, there's no question about that. But I mean, at the same time, it was done with incredible callousness, you know, and lack of respect for the place where they were doing it. So I photographed everything, which we're going to be seeing now, and that was in 1984 or 1987. And for almost, you know, 25 years or so, I didn't do anything with it, because I didn't know what to do. It was so, there are things that are so overwhelming that it's very hard to improve on them, so to speak. You know, that you risk of doing the opposite. You know, to just, you know, lowering the you know, the level that you would like to keep. So finally, what was done was a book, and telling the whole story and showing the images, which of course, I mean, most of the people that weren't even aware that ever happened there. You know? And this is what we're seeing now. This is all faked. This photograph is taken from the top of the church, and again, everything you see on the left side, not in the background, that's real. but all this is taken, and here you can get a glimpse of all the the structure that was built in order to hold it in place. All this was brought in. The rubble also was added because otherwise it was clean. They sprayed the buildings with black in order to make them look like they were smoked, by powder smoke. They added signs, like sharp signs, and to look like it was a British. Everything was in English at least. And they also lost. I counted 3 buildings that I had photographed a couple of years earlier, and they were not there anymore. So something must have happened, and probably they were new because they also painted the interiors. Whatever could be seen from outside was also painted. And I figured that, when they started moving, because everything was being held with chewing gum, some of them just came crashing down. In this, at the entrance of the old town, you can see there in all this clothing that's hanging, like it was lying. In the back, all these black smoke marks, so to speak, that was applied with a spray over there. Same thing, but in this arch, this is authentic. That's the real thing. That balcony up there. Right there, they 40 years earlier, had been a machine gun manned by Americans that were covering the entire length of the main street that reaches all the way down to the church. So to see that place transform into a sort of a, as I said before, a farce, it was quite an impression. I had photographed everything before when that was clean, so this second visit was quite something. This obviously was also built for effect. A cart with coffins. And it was extremely well executed with some anachronic elements like these Roman siege tower, which obviously that in the 18th century that didn't exist, wasn't used anymore. But again, that wall, the defending wall with the batteries, with the cannons, that's also fake. And yes, you turned around, and that's what you saw. All the artifice and all the, what made that fake thing, to become a reality if you were watching it from, the proper side, the other side. This looks like an 18th century photograph, from a colonial war, in China or something like this. And what gives it away is, this scale, stick that they were using, to determine distances when they were doing the shooting. So this is, I thought there was an introduction, and now we're going to go to something a little more involved, and you have to bear with me because I have to look for it. Okay. There we go. Years later, we're now at the end of the 20th century. I had been working with a group of people. I was the only artist. The rest of the people in the team were archaeologists, medical forensic anthropologists, and people who were interested in breaking the ice. We're talking about 1999, 2000. And so we could start investigating the physical, remains of the Spanish Civil War, which at the time were still untouched. And we were considering the whole thing, not only these people who had been executed and put in common graves, and also, but everything else, because most of us had visited the battlefields in Normandy and in Flanders and northern France, and you see all these former battlefields that are perfectly kept. The research is still being conducted. They don't stop. They're finding things constantly, and when you consider the First World War, we're talking about 100 years ago. There's still work going on, and the effects of that war also have a very tangible, reality that you can actually touch. To this day, the peasants that operate tractors, they need to have the underside of the tractors protected, steel plated, because they run into unexploded ammunition from 100 years ago. When they built the TGV, the train de grande vitesse, the bullet train, in that part of the French landscape, in a period of 16 years, they had 87 workers that died from the effects of running into live ammunition. So it's like it's like going to play golf. I mean, there's a very bad analogy, if you will, but you hit that, and you happen to hit the tip of an artillery charge that was shot 100 years, and it explodes under your nose. It's almost this radical. It's so they continue working. They think that's important. They respect their country and their history, and that's what they do. There are museums. There are centers where you can go. They receive you. They explain everything. And it's oriented towards education, towards young people, and whoever's interested in knowing what happened there. You compare that with Spain, the Ebro River Valley, which is a place where a major battle took place, and you kick a stone and you find something of all kinds. The ammunition, personal objects left behind by the soldiers, and of course, every once in a while, you run into bones. Nobody's doing anything about it to this day. So, some of us thought that was, something, dramatically wrong. And it was very difficult to touch because there was very little political will in that direction, but there were, somebody has to do it, so let's try. And we thought that rather than saying, well, we are going to go to X place because we know that there is a common grave of soldiers, if we started this way, that wasn't going to go anywhere. We said, no, we're going to do a campaign, an archaeological campaign, traditional, but based on the military history of the place. And so, we're going to explore the old trenches, the old fortifications, and we knew that as soon as we started digging, that, we were going to find other things than stones, And then there is a law that if you happen to run into human remains someplace, you cannot just, leave it and forget about it. You are obliged to find out what happened by an emergency procedure, as they're called. They are called these things over there, So it has to be done. And then we thought, well, we opened that Pandora box, and that's it. Once it's there, there's no way to avoid it, and they will have to do it, and so we'll see what happens. Well, it was impossible, and it was a long, drawn-out process until finally after of course, things were changing along the process, we finally, when we thought that we were very close to do a real campaign, and that particular case was a military common grave in Catalonia. The common graves are military rather than civilian. In the parts of the country that fell in fascist hands right away, the repression was tremendous, and that's where you find civilians. In the parts of Spain that stayed loyal to the Republic and fought against the fascists, then the thing's just the opposite. All the common graves are soldiers, and you find very little in terms of civilians because they were protected. The military were protecting civilians. So we had the place located, and we were told that we couldn't. We were forbidden to proceed. The first time by center-right government, Catalan Nationalist government, and the second time by a leftist government that was composed of 3 different parties, and we had all voted for one of them. The people of the team who were instrumental in having these people elected. When we proceeded with, again, putting all the paperwork through and all that, we were told to no, again. So the problem obviously was transit ideological, had nothing to do with being left or right, was something more profound, which meant that basically the country was not prepared, not willing to deal with it, regardless of ideology, based on what I think, the fantasy that to do that was going to be politically dangerous. It would create, instability, and that wasn't good for the health of the new democracy. So after the second time, I said, well, now I'm in really big trouble because I had people behind that had been supporting the project, 2 American foundations, the Fulbright, and I didn't have a place to go. So, like, my God, the first time was easy. I said, well, it's a center-right government, and the church has a lot of influence. A Christian Democrat. But next time we'll get it done. And then our guys win. The same thing, the same result. So what they're going to tell me? Who are your friends? Who are you talking to? So finally, I called an organization that I had become a member, an organization that's called the Organization for the Recuperation of Historical Memory, which is now a very famous organism. But back then it was just the beginning. They had opened the first civilian grave, a common grave, in Leon, which is in the northern part of the country. And that was like a major event. Nothing like this had been done legally up until then. And their mission was to recover people who had been unlawfully executed during the war and after the war, because the extermination continued after the end of the war, especially while Nazi Germany was still in existence. So that wasn't really along the lines of what I had in mind, but I called them and I said, this is what happens. And they said, well, we do have a campaign that it's ready to go. Tomorrow we can be in the field, and we don't have a cent. So I said, okay, I have a cent or two, and I don't have a project because they don't let me do it. And so literally the next day I was in Bulgars, and we started to dig. So the place had been researched already. All the preliminary work had been done. And by the time I got there, the location was already, found. And the first, they reduced the level, 1 meter until they found the first specimens, pieces of bone and stuff. They had to stop, call the police, the civilian guard, so they could take their samples, take it to the laboratory, determine that they were more than 25 years old. So if there had been a crime, had already prescribed. And then they said, okay, now you can proceed. We have the permission from the mayor and etc. The thing was started by one gentleman who was trying to find his grandfather, and he also had enough money to rent the first piece of machinery that helped to open the place. It was next to a dumping ground. That's something that's very, very common. You find common graves near or under dumping grounds. So it's like first you have to go through a layer of garbage before you get to the grave itself. So a little faded, but with the light, that's how it is. As soon as we started working, that was it. Boom. You can see it's the frontal part of a skull with the eyes, the broken nose, and that hole is a coup de grace, the shot fired to make sure that the person is dead. We were expecting to find anywhere between 40 to 50 or maybe more bodies. All male. Finally we found 46. All male. The youngest was 17 years old, and the oldest in his 70s. And there were, brothers. There was a father and a son, cousin. Everybody knew everybody, and I think that even the ones who fired the shots also knew, who were there, and who were going after, even before they got there. And that took place the night of the 13th of September of 1936. So it was just shortly after the beginning of the war. That part of the country had already fallen in fascist hands, so the repression started. When the people that we had, the team that did the initial research was involved with determining who was there or who could be there and how it went before they were taken. They went to the local jail in Burgos, and they found the records. And all of them appeared as released prisoners. And they did that, of course, on purpose, because while they were in jail, the families would go and visit them and bring food or clean clothes or whatever. Until one day that they would tell, oh, sorry, but this person is no longer here. And how come? He was released, and there was a date and everything. And yeah, they were released. As soon as they crossed the entrance, there was already a truck, with phalangists, which was, the Spanish equivalent of the Field of Youth or the National Socialist SS. Which would take them 30 kilometers away, and in a half an hour they were all dead. So it was very quickly done. They were executed first in a kind of a orderly way. There were 2/3 of the grave in which all the bodies were placed, like sardines, like this, and they were all like that. So they had been shot, nearby, and then they were grabbing them from by the armpits. They dragged them and threw them in the grave. By the time they reach the end, the last third, they either run out of time or patience, or they get tired of it, and they're all kind of, you know, mixed, you know. So what happened is that they wanted to finish quickly, and they made them go down into the hole, and from the top they were shot. Because all the bullet casings that we were finding, the first 2/3 of the grave, they were you know, pistol cases, and the casings that we were finding at the end were Mauser, you know, rifle military cases. In the same level, archaeological level, where we were finding the bullet cases, we were also finding beer bottle caps. So it was, you know, they were drinking beer, and well, they were, you know, shooting all the civilians. So there was this sort of carnivalesque, Goya kind of, you know, absolute awful stuff. And of course, they had things, and that, you know, whatever they took, and which was, you know, the typical sort of elements that one would take when is arrested and taken to jail. You know, you have, you know, 2 minutes to whatever, grab whatever you can, money, combs, glasses, watches. You know, all this was, you know, among the corpses. Well, one thing that I should address is why did I do that? I did because I thought that it was necessary. Because up to that moment, none of these kinds of campaigns had been documented with the intention of making it public. Usually, if there was any record, it was all forensic, and went straight to the forensic departments of universities, and that was where it stayed forever. Nobody other than the specialists, you know, had access to them. And I think I thought it was important, very important, you know, to bring it to the public arena. I didn't know how yet, but the first step was, you know, to document the whole process, from beginning to end. Not with the intention of making an artwork, because I thought that that was going to be a bad way to start. I thought, well, do what you think that you have to do, and if the end result of all that happens to be an artwork, great. If it isn't, no, doesn't matter, you know, because the real issue here is to make this sort of, you know, problematic to become, you know, to be in the surface, and to, you know, be taken into the conscious level of the country. The methodology is like, doesn't matter whether you are exhuming a relatively recent grave or you're doing, you know, a Roman necropolis. The methodology is exactly the same. The emotional aspects of it, of course, are very different. And the team was all composed of volunteer people, very young people, students, forensic students, historians from 3 different universities, and the directors of the campaign were these 2 gentlemen that you see at the very end. The one with the hat is very well known, is Francisco Echevarria, who became very well known because years ago he was the one who identified 2 young guys, Basque guys, that had been illegally executed by the police and you know, haphazardly buried and under a lot of that white stuff that you use, you know, lacao, como se llama? Yeah, yeah. So the 13 years after the fact, you know, he managed to identify them. He became very prominent, and he is the force behind all this movement. You know, I think that by now he has probably unearthed more than 1,000 people. And these are the guys, you know, the very young people. This fellow came from the University of Madrid, and with this unbeatable T-shirt that I had to photograph. And the relatives had access to the whole procedure from day one. They could be there all the time. You know, if they had questions, objections, anything. That was addressed. And here I see these three ladies who are the daughters of one of the victims. And they're being interviewed by a team of two anthropologists, one from the Basque Country, the other one from Holland, that have been conducting a comparative study of how mourning is being performed according to different cultures. And so it's a wonderful body of work. So here they're, you know, talking about their experience, and of course, well, you know, that's what was unavoidably found. All of them had been shot in the head at least once, in addition to all the different impacts it had received in the body. There were fractures that were done perimortem, that, you know, before they were killed, just to, you know, inflict pain, etc., etc. Here, Francisco Echeverria, using this long stick that was being used as a marker, you know, every time that an object would surface, you know, that was planted right next to it with a little label. He took one of these sticks and shows the trajectory of a shot. Came in, you know, in the back of the head and out, you know, from the top. A rifle bullet casing. That's towards the end of the grave. Here, you know, the living and the dead, all the same place. And that was something that made my skin curl. You know, the feet of the victims. You know, this one was probably a peasant, was wearing espadrilles with a rubber sole and fabric. You know, of course, the fabric had disintegrated, and the soles were still in place. You know, there were other people that were carrying, they were wearing leather shoes, but primarily they're all, you know, people from the 3 or 4 villages around the area. People who had been employed by the mayors, you know, there were a couple of teachers, you know, the usual kind of, you know, portrait of the victim, you know, people who, anything had to do with culture and with institutions. Democratic institutions were the ones who became, you know, automatically victims, you know, without, of course, trial. And the objects. So, a comb and this thing, it's actually a pouch. And inside of the pouch there was a watch. And this fellow still had the ring, you know, in his finger. There have been instances where there were women, of course, and also children. But in this case, we only found men. Pair of glasses that the victim had in the interior, the jacket was gone, but, you know, the glasses were still in position. It was a very haphazard kind of, you know, composite, you know, to see only one part of the first half of the grave. And 2 weeks later, that's all it took. It goes very fast. All the bodies were removed. They were put in boxes and sent to the forensic department at the University of Madrid, Universidad Autónoma, where all the work of identifying and, you know, and studying the remains was conducted. was supposed to take 6 months. It took 2 years, but it was done. And the last day, everybody, people from the village, relatives that came from, of course, 80 years later, these 46 people, families of them had, multiplied and spread, covering the entire country. So they came, and there was this sort of gathering, and poems were read, and it was very emotional. And what was left behind was the empty grave with all the flowers and the letters and texts that people brought with them. That was first part of it. Then well, what do I do? I didn't decide what to do. I just postponed it one more time because I wasn't really sure that I could go any further. But what happened next was that's 2 years after, when all the scientific work had been performed, and we managed to identify 44 out of 46, which is not bad. And the only two that we couldn't was because there was no family, so we couldn't take ADN samples, and there was no way to go any further. But all the others were identified. These kind of boxes that you see, that's each individual victim, and that's back to the village where we had our base, City Hall. Everybody was asked to come. There was a gathering. The forensic people and especially Francisco Echeverria explained the whole process, from beginning to end, and how they did it, especially what the relatives couldn't see, which was all the lab work and everything that had taken place in the university that had to be explained, so they would understand what was done and how it was done, and so on and so forth. And once that took place, then everybody was, one member of each family was called, and the remains were given to that person. He was the one who initiated the whole thing. Fernando. It was supercharged. It was really like, everybody came in from the village, in addition to people who came from outside, including relatives of the people that we knew that had been in the team that had, done the deeds. And it was public knowledge. And they came, and they publicly supported what had been done, and they said it was about time, and thank you. So the whole idea that this type of activities, these actions, these performative actions towards the preservation of memory are not advisable, because it's one way to perpetuate the trauma. It's just a pile of bologna. It's just the opposite. Once it's done, it's done. Then is when you can forget about it. Then there's closure. If there is no closure, it never ends. So there's a part of healing in the whole process that is extremely, extremely important. It's obvious that's the only way, to reach an end. And as long as you don't do that, you're living in a sick country. And not knowing where is it that you are stepping, because there's no way to tell in what place the other 150,000 people who are known to have been, killed, were finally, put to rest. So they could be anywhere, under the house that you buy. I'm exaggerating, but potentially this is the reality that you deal with. So there's no way around it. And up to this day, now, this is still a problem that there's no way to solve in Spain. And we are not the only ones. But there are other countries where, it has been done in another way with much more courage. I mean, the Rwandans they dealt with it, you know, 3 or 4 years after, you know, that tragedy took place. In Argentina also, and Chile, many, many places, but in Spain, there's absolutely no way so far in which, you know, this can be dealt with and under, you know, some sort of normality. So everybody was coming out with the remains of his or her relative, and made a line in the square, and once they were done with you know, the process, then there was this sort of procession that went towards the cemetery, where sort of a mausoleum, very modest, had been built, because and that was done with the collaboration of the relatives. You know, what do we do now? And they said, well, you know, they spent, you know, almost 80 years, you know, laying together, so let's gonna keep them the same way. So every single one of them went into the mausoleum, but it was done in a way that if later on the relatives, you know, changed their minds and they wanted to retrieve it and, you know, bring it to their own personal, you know, place, or they could do that. So it was semi-permanent sort of situation. And some people did. I mean, this is 2006. We're talking about 12 years ago. And this past years, a few families took the remains away and buried them again, you know, near to their home, basically. This gentleman was carrying, you know, his grandfather. It was done with very little money, as you can see. I mean, you know, it was like bare bones, you know. It's amazing. A poem in the as part of the mausoleum is written by the granddaughter of one of the victims. An interesting family. There were three sisters. Like they were not the ones that we saw before. Another 3 sisters, and one of them married the richest fellow in the village, and went to Burgos, which is the main capital. You know, lived there the rest of her life. Very bourgeois. The second one became a nun. And the third one, the one who wrote the poem, became a member of the Communist Party. So it's also a very eloquent portrait of you know, social fabric of the conflict. And there was this Chinese girl that was just running around, you know, and I said, who the hell is she? And well, she had been adopted by the grandsons or daughters of one of the victims, and so she was Spanish, you know, Chinese Spanish. and I thought, well, if you can be Chinese and Spanish at the same time, I think that, you know, we certainly we are in a better world right now than we were, you know, 80 years ago. It was very, very, very emotional, needless to say. And, you know, at sundown, everybody went home. That was it. So then again, now what? What do I do? You know, what do I do with all this? And I didn't know. So finally I thought, well, I'm going to go and talk to the ICP, the International Center of Photography, because if nothing else, at least the only thing that, you know, that serves as a kind of, you know, something that we can all chew on, is the fact that, you know, I've been photographing it, you know, and the ICP, I had worked with them in the past, so they really knew me. And I said, well, I have this, and I really don't know what to do, because, I mean, the idea of documenting something like this, being a common grave and whatever goes with it, and then ending up doing an artwork that's going to be in a Museum of Contemporary Art. It's just like, it's something that, no, it doesn't quite do it. So, you know, you need a different context, you know, and I couldn't find it. So after talking to them, and when they decided this, well, I think that we know what you can do, or we can do with it, is we are preparing another definitive exhibition of Robert Capa, and along with it, we're going to have the first retrospective of Gerda Taro, first retrospective ever, the two of them at the same time. And we think that this would go perfectly with that, you know, to close the circle, because you photograph what they couldn't. And so then I became a photographer, because up until that point I was taking pictures, but you know, I never thought that I was a photographer. I was an artist who took pictures. When they told me that I was going to photograph, to show, you know, with that unbelievable, unfathomable company, you know, my knees turned to pudding, and I thought, well, so let's go ahead and do it, and you know, if the thing happens to be a disaster, well, you deserve it. So, and this is what finally the whole thing, as an art project, as a personal project, ended up looking like. This thing here, there was a pretty large image that was a reticular image that allowed you to see two images at the same time as you walked along. It was long enough, you know, to have, you know, a complete, you know, change, you know, with very nice transitions. So you saw, taken from the top, the bones on the grave, and slowly it turned into the other image, which was the newest part of Barcelona that was developed along with the Olympic Games and a whole big deal, and was built right on top of the grounds where during several years after the war, the Republican prisoners or political prisoners still in jail were periodically taken out, brought to the, it's a beach, brought to the beach and shot right there, you know, and it's called El Campo de la Bota, the barrel field. Of course, there is nothing to commemorate what happened. There's a very tiny plaque that you miss because it was invisible. Later on, they did the monument, but it's an abstract sculpture that it could be anything. And what emerged architecturally was the image of the New Spain that the political power would like to project, so everything else is just history basically. And if you don't talk about it, the better off you are. And then you would travel across this field of images. In this case, what I did, instead of doing the piece or the exhibition and then or simultaneously having the book, I mean, it was obvious that with that material I could do a book without any problem whatsoever, I mean, without any contradiction. So I did the book first before I did the exhibition, and the book served as a pattern, as a cast, for the narrative of the exhibition, which was identical to the book, but it was much more condensed. The book had 150, 160 images, and the exhibition had only 35 or 40. They were not, of course, mounted nor framed. They were just, push pinned directly on the wall. Another thing that, again, it had to be taken into consideration was the size. And I always defended that they had to be as big as possible. And some of my colleagues, they were saying, but, you know, but you are spectacularizing, you know, the material. You know, you're kind of, you know, putting too much emphasis on the shocking part of, you know, because of the size and all this. And I thought, yeah, well, this is one danger of doing it this way. But to doing it small, it's like, you know, you're trying to do the opposite, you know, to minimize it and make it, you know, something that it doesn't really, you know, startle anybody, and so it's somewhat digestible. And I stuck to the size, and the size was determined by the walls, basically, wherever I could fit. This is the kind of landscape of the area where we did the the campaign. It's almost like a sea of hay, you know, that Mar de Castilla, Castilian Sea, they call it. There's no water there, of course. And it's with a lot of, you know, details of what we found. Remains of clothing. Relatives, witnesses. That's the second room. And there were two elements here that were important. The base of everything that you saw was photographic. Everything was photo, except one thing, including the carpet. Actually, you know, when you saw it from a distance, it looked like you were looking at bones, but they weren't bones. Were the intertwined roots of the trees that were under the bodies, and that was printed on fabric. And in that transparent case, we had one of the two watches that appeared. I picked this one because it was missing the arms, so it wasn't marking the time, you know, the hour. The piece, it's now in the permanent collection of the ICP. Every time that goes up, we have to borrow the watch because that belongs to one of the families, and you know, they didn't want to just give it to us, you know. So we have an agreement. There's going to be a show, you know. Can we have it? And yes, they always say yes, and then, you know, we get the watch. These are the names of all the people who were in the grave, and this image here, it's not a light box. It's something that's called lumographics, and it's wonderful. It used to be wonderful. This is the first generation of lumographics, and it was very fragile, so they made it much more resilient, and because of that, now it doesn't look as nice as they used to be, at the beginning. Just imagine a transparency. It can be of any size. You know, you can fold and everything. And from one corner were two almost invisible, like a spider web, you know, lines that would go into a tiny transformer about this size that would be plugged to the juice, and the transparency itself, like plasma, it would light up. So and it was hung, you know, with two little pincers in front like this. Without touching the wall, you could put your hand behind, and it was emanating light. And that was the image was the last image that we saw from the first series of pictures, which is, you know, the empty grave, you know, and then you had to go back, you know, following the same path that we took at the entrance. And that's it. How are we doing with time?
Yeah, I think we can. I'm just trying to remember. I think you could show some of the 9/11
Okay.
project. I think
These two, they work together very well. These two pieces, but I'll try to make it quick because I'm afraid that we're gonna overshoot the time that we have.
we don't have to leave the room at 6, so
Yeah,
no need
no,
to
but
leave
then
it
I don't want to tire you
exercises.
with,
So,
too much. In a way, something similar happened again with the piece that I'm going to show now. Okay. In 1986, I was in New York at NYU. I was invited for a whole year. And coinciding with that, I was told by a friend, Francesc, there is something that you have to see. The best kept secret in New York. And New York is a city where it's very difficult to keep secrets. Yeah. And nobody knows about that. And, but you have to see it because you won't believe it. And I said, what is it? He says, the person who told me it was somebody who was working for City Hall in urban development. So she knew all the little, things about every single neighborhood. And he says, it's a hangar, an aviation hangar in the cargo area of JFK, where they kept everything that they felt when they were doing the cleaning of Ground Zero, 9/11, that it had to be preserved because it had historical significance. They couldn't really, preserve everything because there were, thousands of tons of material, but at the same time, that was history, and it couldn't just simply be thrown away. But it was complicated because once the cleanup started, which was almost immediately after the attack, it was 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 6 months. That's how long it took. There was a team that was improvised by functionaries, civil servants at the Port Authority, engineers. It's quite incredible. That were constantly going around the perimeter of Ground Zero. And what happened? Okay. And when they saw something that caught their attention, even if they had doubts, confronted with the doubts, they would put it aside. All kinds of things, architectural pieces of structure of the buildings, vehicles, personal objects, you name it, up to 0.01% of the entire amount of rubble that was produced during the attack. That 0.01% was enough to fill a hangar where you could actually sleep a 747 inside with the tail and everything. When I finally managed to get in under the radar, I couldn't bring a camera, nothing, just to see it. I thought, well, this is the 9/11 museum. That should be the 9/11 museum, because everything was it was all very nicely put together, with a kind of a museographic mind, very well kept. Of course, they couldn't have the entire space controlled for humidity and temperature, but things that were delicate then were put inside of constructions that were built on purpose, and that cubicle was controlled with museum quality measures. It was, it was moving. So, well, again, there's somebody here who knows the importance of history in a country that, respects itself, sufficiently, in order to make sure that they don't lose, the historical patrimony. So this is what I found. I mean, these are pieces of the. If you remember the buildings, that there was this column that would go up. Would go over the level of the lobby, which was about 6 stories high, and then it would split in 3, and that would then continue all the way up to the top. So these are pieces of that had to be cut in order to be able to be moved. and just instead of being vertical, they're all laying down. You know? And steel of all kinds. And the first thing that struck me, I think we'll get to it. You see the trident, that thing. In the museum now, in Ground Zero, the new museum, they have two of them that have been reassembled, and they're standing up. 150 years ago, a twisted beam was a twisted beam, period. Now, because of what we know about modern art, contemporary art, even if you don't necessarily have to be heavily involved with art, because through popular culture, everybody knows what a Reichenberg looks like. And we also know that a crash car can be a sculpture. John Chamberlain made a career out of crashing cars. So when you see a twisted beam that has, because it's unavoidable, because your eye reads it whether you want it or not, has some sort of aesthetic value, even beauty, boy, you're in trouble. How do you photograph the object then, right? I'm trying to find what illustrates that. There we see one that it's a pretty good example. This one. This is a section of the guiding rail of a elevator that got crushed, and so everything was cut to pieces, in order to be able to move them. So there was no decision. How can we put it here, we put it there, or whatever was their pump. They call it in period. But you had this result. I mean, this is if you say this is a sculpture, everybody's going to say, okay, sure, but you cannot shoot it like if it was a sculpture, because there is nothing to be sort of enjoyed out of what the information that this object is actually giving you. So how do you photograph it? I had to reconcile myself with the fact that there is no formula, that I had to go by instinct. Like again, this looks like a Mark de Subaru. I mean, it's and plus it has all these marks and these letters. They not private citizens, but entities, public organizations or whatever, were allowed to go in and pick the things that they wanted, and as long as they took care of the transportation costs, they could take it away. Because the idea was that this was a temporary solution; it had to be dispersed. So all these things had already been picked by the fire department to be taken to different headquarters and ladder houses. So that's why it has FD New York, fire department New York City. Yeah. This looks like a Richard Serra. If you don't photograph it because you think, well, because it looks like a Richard Serra, you are not photographing one of the most interesting, objects that you have in front of you, and you are there with the obligation of photographing everything that you have in front of you. Also, that doesn't make any sense, to grab a camera and with the deliberate intention of taking a bad picture so nobody can accuse you of indulging yourself, with the aesthetic qualities of something that's the result of a tragedy. But again, I mean, I've never seen more Antoni Tapias or Jasper Jones or Robert Reichenberg's that in Hangar 17, by the dozen. The way it was shot, that was in 2009, and digital photography still didn't have enough, good definition in order to get big images. I already thought that whatever I was going to do with them, obviously, they had to be large. So I went back and I shot it with an analog film, with a big frame camera. I didn't bring any additional lighting or anything like this. I said, I'm going to photograph it just as is. I'm not going to remove a little, not even a tag or nothing. And the light, well, whatever I encounter, I'll deal with it. And of course, there were like at least two different kinds of lighting. There were, tungsten lighting and daylight. So of course, with color, it gives you, throws everything away. If you choose tungsten, then you get the other part, off, and vice versa. So I thought, well, I'll do the best I can, and then, I'll try to correct it, afterwards, see if I can find, one way of getting a color, a chroma that is acceptable. Since I didn't have any additional lighting, some of the exposures in the places where it was almost in the dark could reach like 12 minutes. And I had to take several because I was guessing. I didn't know. So the first one was going to be 6 minutes, second one was going to be 8, and until I got it right. And talking about what's art and what isn't, this, which looks like scrap metal, that's what's left of the Calder sculpture that was in outside in between the two towers. It became completely, it was flattened completely, and again the workers didn't know better, so they were cutting with the acetylene gun, and when they had already made 7 pieces out of it, somebody said, hey, this is the Calder. Too late. So, but in spite of that, since it was art, I mean, this is, the whole thing is like going 180 degrees, and this is art. Then it was put inside of its own cubicle, and it was, controlled by, with humidity and temperature and everything, like if it was in a museum. Right? So, every single little detail of it, it's enough to write a book about museography and what kind of criteria, will follow in order to decide what is what and how we do this or instead of that, and so on and so forth. I mean, they're also beautiful and they don't write. I mean, so. This is the what they call the last column. It's not a column; it's just a beam, a structural beam, and it was the very last element that was removed from ground zero, and was brought. I mean, no, this thing wasn't the place. The hangar wasn't open to the public, but they took care of having everything almost like if it was going to be on display. Somebody was going to see it. I mean, there was like half a dozen souls, but still they put this mirror under so you could see the underside and everything. Being the last element that was removed, it became a big deal. So everybody who had been working with the cleanup for 6 months, they wrote something, they attached the photo, the picture of the child, or whatever. So the whole thing was covered with objects. They felt that it was important enough, to be preserved. But it was posing an unprecedented problem of a curatorial problem, because all the materials that were used, to attach, were not archival. The adhesive tape, had a lot of acid. These things, don't last. So they had to study the way to stabilize, all the chemical aspects that were there boiling in order to be able to preserve the column as it was. Again, I find this, it always brings, tears to my eyes, that to really want, need to do something like this. It says a lot about, the people who do it, and the country in which it's done. And I mean, it was spectacular. It was just, you know, undescribable. This was the first thing that was removed from Hangar 17 and went to the ground zero, back to ground zero, to be part of the museum. Since it was so big, they had to place it based on the plan before the building existed. Because if they had built the building first, there wouldn't have been any way to get the column inside. So it was, again, a feat of, forethought and know-how, how to solve problems. These things, there were paintings, there were even photographs of posters with the images, the photographs of firemen that died was brought, by the colleagues with flowers, and there was, all the flowers completely dry, had to be preserved, somehow. There was another part, again, another independent, construction, fairly large, where they had all the vehicles, and that was also, a sight to behold, because all these vehicles, have carbonized, burned in a very strange way, because only one part could be completely burned, and the rest almost left untouched. And so how could that happen? Well, there were plenty of them. And the first time that I saw the museographic project for the museum that is now at Ground Zero, it was a public presentation. I happened to be in New York, and so I could attend. And when we were over, I told the director, I said, look, you have to dirty this thing up, because the way you have it right now, it's going to look like MoMA. Precisely for all this, what I was mentioning before about, this confusion between, what could be art and it isn't, but, you are used to it. And so you take a fire engine, you put it in there, all clean. They had to be clean because the dust that I photographed, that I thought there was, the most important elements of the object, the patina, the dust that was made with, everything, the whole thing turned into dust, and that we were breathing for weeks. Had a lot of asbestos, so the objects could not be put on public display because they were potentially dangerous. So they cleaned everything. As soon as they cleaned everything, they killed it. That's the way you see it now, and it looks like a dead thing. And it was just really impressive. This is very interesting. That's the hood of a fire department vehicle. You see this 1K. When the first responders arrived, they were looking inside of the vehicles that had people, and to see if they were dead or alive. If they were alive, they would stop and take care of them. If they were dead, there was one. They would put 1K, one killed, or 2 or 3 or whatever. So the guys who were coming behind, they wouldn't bother, and they would just go directly to people who actually needed help. People who were dead, that was it. There was nothing you could do with them. That's the vehicle of the chief of the fire department in New York that died. Didn't die in the car. He died inside of one of the towers when it collapsed. Of course, every one of these objects, had a story that you could trace, and it ended up with someone who had a name. This ambulance was very weird because it was totally burned inside, but the outside wasn't. It's only one part, So what happened in there? For this interior to be totally obliterated by fire, and the rest of the vehicle to be almost, not quite, almost untouched. So as I was shooting this, again, the same question is like, once you have all these pictures, and once you have documented not only the objects, but also the container, because the whole thing as a narrative artifact, building and what it was inside, was absolutely, extraordinary. And it was temporary, so it had to be documented. But what are you going to do? The only, let's say, civilian vehicle, because all the other vehicles were the police or whatever, city entities. The only one that wasn't was this cab. And it was a Ford Crown Victoria, which is not anymore, but at the time was the quintessential New York taxi cab. And everybody who lived in the city or visited had been inside one of those vehicles. So to see one like this, and I mean, at least, I don't know, maybe I'm a little too, impressionable, but when I saw myself there, any of us could have been in there, which is obvious, but not enough, to acknowledge that. The other thing is just to actually feel it, which is something that art can do, that other tools maybe don't do it just the same way. I'm going to go quick because I want to get to the final format that all this took. Again, how are you going to deal with it? What are you going to do? Blah, blah, blah. I thought that it had to be imposing. Couldn't be small. It was like, the same thing that happened with the other piece. It had to be big, it was something that was very big. But it couldn't be spectacular. It couldn't use too much in terms of artifice. It had to be as austere and as basic as possible. So the contents of that comes from one of the hotels, but also a lot of stuff came from the mall and all the stores that were there. Like the Warner Brothers store had all these figures, and had this puppet, which is the character of the Wizard of Oz, the girl, can't remember her name, and they had them all, like half a dozen of them, and all in this shelves, one next to another. It looked like a morgue. And all with the tags, all cataloged and identified. Every single piece of dust was recorded. Dorothy, in fact, I remember. And what was a real killer was this. Yeah. That's all, folks. I think it appeared always at the end of the animated films. They came from a pharmacy in the mall. It was about this store. There were all these glasses, and all of them were intact. Two towers had, come down on them, or at least one, and they survived. And I used them. I used that later. These are the jackets from the security people in the building. This sleeper, there's no way to tell for sure, but the first impact was an American Airlines flight. And it was a long-distance flight. So usually in long-distance flights, not anymore because now everybody's cutting costs. But at the time, you were given a pair of slippers so you could be comfortable. And I cannot really say for sure, but most likely that's where it comes from. There were no pieces of, you probably noticed that already, there were no fragments of the planes, because all that was forensic evidence that went straight to Washington. The FBI had it, and once they finished doing what they had to do with it, they returned it to their owners, which were the airlines. So now if you go to the museum in Ground Zero, there's a big piece of one of the planes, but that's all. And of course, I mean, again, you know, it's all completely, you know, cleaned, and there's not a spot of dust to be found anywhere. That's quite something. This one, I think that's probably the next one. So, I'm sorry that I'm looking for that. Whoop. That doesn't want to go back. Well. Yeah. Sorry. Okay. This was it looked like a ball of magma, like if it just come out of a volcanic explosion, and it's a little hard to see, but there are 4 layers, and these are 4 floors of the South Tower compressed into a mass that's about 5 feet high. So the amount of energy that was produced in order to melt literally 4 floors of concrete and everything that went in it, it's quite something. So the relatives were scandalized and very worried that any of those big blocks could become part of the permanent exhibition when the real museum would open. And they were, no, you cannot use this because there may be people there. They did all kinds of testing. They couldn't find any traces of organic remains, nothing. But at the same time, they couldn't really tell for sure that wasn't the case because, damn it, sorry. No, it does whatever it wants to do. I apologize. Okay. In the middle of all this magma, you would encounter blocks of that look like coal, or black, but you could see that there were like vertical lines going, and so you took a cutter and separated them. You realize that was carbonized paper, had been compressed and burned, but kept together. So if you touched it, it became powder. But if otherwise, they would still hold, and they still had rest of whatever was written in them that can be read. Receiver, whoever that means, and whoever that person was. Then these beams, that was quite something too, because there were a lot of them, and some of them they were very, very large, very long, and they were all full of cutouts. And what happened is that since the relatives were there all the time, similar to what had happened in Burgos, when we were digging, because they never knew when something would surface, it could be a relative. So they were all the time there, and they became friends with the workers that they were there. So the workers, they would say, well, what denomination are you? I'm Christian, I'm Jew, whatever. And they would, with the pistol, they would cut Stars of David or crosses, and they would give it to them as a memento. And of course, I mean, they ended up with, dozens of beams all cut out, But this looks like Antoni Tapia's, painting by Catalan, very famous Catalan painter. The antenna. They don't have carts on the path line. They were in pretty good shape. They were, had marks outside, but the interiors were just immaculate. And these are objects that were found inside of the cars. And again, everything was cataloged, everything was kept. I used that too. It was a little, ship, made of paper. Probably a child made it. That when I finally showed the piece, it was coinciding with the 10th anniversary of 9/11, and it was shown simultaneously in 4 places: in New York at the ICP, in London at the Imperial War Museum, in Madrid, in a center that belongs to the City Hall, and in Barcelona in the Center for Contemporary Culture, and it all open simultaneously. And let's see if we finally get to the very close. That's the problem. Well, this project is like, there's never an end. I mean, and try to make it short. There's, how do you make that short? I mean, you can't really shorten something that is bigger than life. I mean, all the bicycles still attached to the I think. Okay. All right. So, what am I going to do with it? Big question. So finally, we are not just going to show, the objects. Again, have to tell have to explain the whole thing because there's a lesson there to be learned. And so dealt with the building, history of the building, and everything. It was an introduction before you went in. There were certain objects that, unless you explained them, there was absolutely no way to tell, for somebody who didn't know, to figure out what they were. So there are only a few, like 6 or 7, that needed, to be put in context. And then here we see the piece. What I had was 6, 7 self-standing walls that acted as screens. They were 2.5 meters by 5, so 15 feet wide by 12 high, approximately, or 10. And I used them as a screen. So there was the image was projected, so it coincided exactly with the shape of the screen. 6 of them, and there was a 7th. We'll see later. So it was very large. The whole thing was very large. No sound, no special effects, nothing. It was in total silence. I had the air conditioner turned off, so it was cold. Inside, when you entered, you felt a difference of temperature. And that was it. Since the projections that, of course, were still pictures, but they read as video, because there were no cuts. There were always, like AV rolls. One would melt into the other. But nonetheless, each projection was nothing more than a specter. It was, like a ghost. Didn't contain any, tangible physical reality. I thought that I needed to anchor all this down by having one element straight from, the collection of objects that to be there, to give the whole thing, the tangibility that I thought it needed. This is the version in Barcelona. Here, I wanted to bring the taxi cab, and I almost had the whole thing negotiated, but they just had taken all the vehicles to the future museum because they had finished the lower floors. The museum goes vertically down 7 stories. And they thought, well, we take the vehicles there, and so once they were there, they couldn't be removed. Then the huge storm came, and everything became inundated with water. It could have been disastrous, but it wasn't completely because they had, I don't know the word in English, so that, you know, when you put this sort of, you know, tense plastic cover around an object. Yeah, it was like books and things, you know, they're all covered with plastic. They did the same thing with the objects, including the vehicles, which is, you know, quite a feat. And so that, you know, that saved them. You know, of course, there was some damage. And then, you know, we have to restore the damage. So how do you determine what was the damage from the storm and what was, you know, again, another one of these, you know, metaphysical, you know, curatorial, you know, problems that actually exist, you know, when you try to do something out of the ordinary. So I couldn't have my taxi cab, but I had one of the cowboy pieces of the sculpture. In Madrid, I had some of the clothing. In London, I had an actual structural beam that was, you know, in meters. I think it was like 12 meters long, and then the images. And the seventh, finally, the seventh screen had nothing projected on it. It was a whole mirror, the same size as the others, in a way that you could see reflected on it the entire piece, and you could also see yourself as part of it. And that's it. And now we're done. So thank you. Been lovely. If you have any questions or anything, I'll be happy to answer them. Yes?
It's very short, and this is just so much to think about. But what was the piece that you had in New York?
Maybe you
just
give your question kind of.
What was, I just was asking what the piece, the tangible piece in the New York.
The paper ship. The little
paper sheet.
Because the space was smaller, so I had to, you know, reduce the scale, and I used the paper sheet.
I'm curious about the Spanish central government. Is this narrative since the Civil War till present? How are they dealing with this now? I mean, are they still trying to keep everything suppressed, or are they opening up? And
yeah, of course, these things cannot be proven because there are always going to be explanations and reasons, and you know, to prove that you're wrong. But my bet is that since they know that they have biology on their side, they're waiting, you know, for all the survivors of the war to die off, and that most likely will reduce the pressure of having to do something, you know, because now the argument from the Association for the Preservation of Historical Memory, for anybody who's involved with that, is to say, look, I mean, you know, we have an obligation towards the relatives that are still alive, you know, but they're all in their 90s. And once you know, this generation is gone, it's not the same. You lose a very powerful argument. You know, it's not the same thing to say, you know, she is the daughter of, you know, somebody who can be in one of the schools. Once it is not the daughter any longer, and it's the niece or the granddaughter, or it becomes more difficult emotionally. You know, there's less pressure. In my opinion, I think that, you know, that, everything remains the same. You know, it doesn't matter. You know? But there is kind of you know, let's wait, and because we have, you know, time without the paper, basically. You know? And the fight is just to fight against that. You know, so, don't think that because you know, very soon in another 5 years, you know, there will be a single survivor left. You know, it's too old. There is still an issue. It has to be dealt. You know, if we really want to feel that, you know, we live in a healthy society. You know? But it's very, very tough. It's very difficult.
Are you saying you want to reopen Catalina of
the Memoria Democratica, democratic memory, and it's a an agency that belongs to is under the auspices of the Catalan government, but it's heavily politicized, which is in a way, the difficulties they had in order to get, that project going was not unlike what threatens this agency, because everybody wants to control it, basically. Certainly there's a political change. This agency is at the brink of disappearing, and if it doesn't disappear, it's because it finds a way to accommodate itself to the ideological requests of whoever happens to be in power. The second time around, when my project that I was stopped, the party that was instrumental in not allowing me to proceed was Esquerra Republicana, which supposedly is a leftist party, Republican and what have you, but because of that, because of being, really, die-hard Catholic before anything else, they want to be the ones who control anything that has to do with the history. And the idea of having someone who is just like a free agent that they cannot really, keep on a short leash makes them, terribly uncomfortable. The one thing that I wish that I had some sort of attached camera someplace, that I could have filmed what happened is when I had a meeting in the presidential palace in Barcelona, the second time around. Because the first time when I was told, no, you can't, by the conservative, nationalist Catalan government. Everybody else sent me a letter saying, hey, what you're doing is great, we support you and everything. I had a letter, from Maragall, who ended up, becoming the president of Catalonia a little later on. Everybody was, yes, this is great. So, of course, the second time around, I thought that I had it made. That's it. It's only a formality. Boom, that's it. No. So I called the presidency and I said, I have all these letters, guys. You want me to go to the press? And she said, no. The president was socialist. We continue to support it, but the problem is, of course, this is a coalition of three parties. We had to split the pie, and Esquerra Republicana has claimed anything that has to do with culture, history, of course, the Catalan essence. And we cannot say, no, you have to let him go because he's a friend of ours. That's not the worst. So we're with you, but there's nothing we can do, except one thing. We will arrange for a meeting with the person who was the direct responsible for this area, who was you'll know, who was the brother of Corrado Rivera. For those of you, it doesn't matter who he was, but and, we had a very complete idea and opinion about this guy. He was the head of the Interdepartmental Commission, something or other. So again, you want something not to happen, create a commission in which public health, national patrimony, everybody in his hand, has to come together and agree on something for that to happen. Never happens. Right? So he was the head. They called me and said, you can go and talk to him, make your case, and good luck. So I went, and that's why too bad that I couldn't record it because it was like, incredible. The first thing that he said is, just when I walked in, he said, well, you have very good friends. Translation. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here, because you are, nobody, right? What can I do for you? And he said, well, you can explain to a Catalan citizen me or whoever, but they happen to be here, so it's me. Why I, as a citizen of this country, cannot proceed with a project that you have said many, many, many times that is a pending issue that has to be resolved. Right? When I have 3 universities behind me, I have 2 American foundations, I have the money, I don't need your money, all I need is your permission to proceed. It doesn't cost you a penny. And I'm willing to be accountable for anything that you may require. This is very delicate. Of course, it is delicate. But I think I'm an asshole, because you always get to the brink of saying something, using the vernacular. We don't have secrets because we're very transparent. But just as we speak, we meaning the government, we are conducting the first campaign to open up and exhume or investigate an area in northern Catalonia where there was an exchange military event, and there was a lot of sediment left there, and so, bravo, great, it was about time. So, but it has nothing to do with what I'm proposing. So we have to do that because that's going to set the basis for a universal protocol of how to proceed when you are, and they use all these terms that they just invented, and you are right at the hole, or whatever. I mean, it was just preposterous. So you're trying to reduce mortality in the highway, and while you're trying to solve this, nobody can take a car, because you have a problem to solve. But it's absurd. You can do that, but at the same time, you can have other things happening. So it went, back and forth, and you're right, yes, but there are many ways to do it, and we had to choose. But don't worry, because by October, that was in July of 2004. By October, we already have a law, and you don't even have to apply. That's it. You have it. So you have to finish this, elaborate the protocol, which has to go to Congress. It has to be consensual, it has to be accepted by everybody, and then turn into a law. We are in July, the vacations are about to start, everybody gets the hell out of here and goes to the beach, and you're telling me that in October we're going to have a law that I don't even have to apply to? Yeah. So I had the last card. I said, but I have one proposal, in addition to one more step. Is this. You send me a team of your guys to work with my team. So all the political commissars that you can come up with, you're welcome. You come, we work together, we do this. The reason why I want to do it, I explain, this is the first time that this is going to be done, and all I want to do is to photograph it. Once I'm done, the scientific results of the campaign are yours. So you get 2 for the price of 1, and it's going to be the very first time that the Catalan artist gives a grant to the government, to do what needs to be done. Right? Give me 2 days. And so I gave him 2 days, and when he called me and he said, no, it has been consulted, we're doing another, and we cannot accept. We have to tell you that you can't. Sorry.